A girl no older than 7 pressed her hand flat against a wood-burning stove. The skin hissed. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She just stood there, watching her own palm burn, then pulled it away and wiped it on her dress like nothing happened. A woman standing in the doorway dropped her clipboard. Her legs locked. Her mouth opened but nothing came out. The girl looked up and smiled. Not a brave smile. Confused one. She genuinely could not understand why a grown woman looked so afraid. That woman was Linda Calloway, 26 years old, a county social worker on her very first solo field assignment. She'd driven 3 hours into backcountry she didn't know existed to check on a family the state had nearly forgotten. What she found inside that house would change how an entire medical community understood human pain. Stay with me on this one. Linda had been given a folder. Thin. 3 pages inside. One was a photocopy of a complaint phoned in to the Boone County Welfare Office 8 months earlier. No name attached. Just a voice on the line saying there were children up past Crooked Fork Road who hadn't been to school in years. Children who looked like they'd been through a war. The second page was a hand-drawn map. Somebody in the office had sketched the route because no proper road map showed it. And the third page was a single line of typed text. Harlow family. Remote. Approach with caution. That was it. That was everything the state of West Virginia had on the Harlows. Linda had asked her supervisor, a man named Dale Pettis, why the file was so thin. He'd leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, and said something she wouldn't forget. Some families don't want to be found, Linda. And around here we respect that. She didn't argue. She was new. She needed the job. But something about that answer didn't sit right. Respecting privacy was one thing. Ignoring children was something else. So on a cold morning in late October of 1976, she loaded her clipboard, a camera, and a county-issued first aid kit into the trunk of her car, and she drove. The last 40 minutes were gravel. Then the gravel turned to dirt. Then the dirt turned to ruts that made her sedan bottom out twice. She almost turned back. Almost. But then the trees opened up and she saw the property. It wasn't one house. It was a cluster. A main structure. 2 smaller cabins flanking it. A barn with a caved-in roof. Chickens loose in the yard. A tire swing hanging from a dead oak. And children. 5 of them. Scattered across the dirt lot. None of them wearing shoes. It was 40 degrees out. Linda parked the car and got out slowly. She raised a hand. None of the children waved back. They just watched her, still as posts. Then a screen door banged open and a man stepped out onto the porch. Tall, lean, sun-creased face, gray stubble. His eyes moved from Linda to her car and back to her again without blinking. "Help you?" he said. She told him her name, told him she was from the county, told him she was there to check on the children. He didn't move, didn't invite her in, just said, "Children are fine." Behind him, through the screen, she could see a woman standing in the shadows, arms folded. Neither of them looked surprised she was there. They looked like they'd been expecting her. Like they'd been expecting someone like her for a long time. The man's name was Earl Harlow. And what Linda noticed about him first wasn't his size, or his silence. It was his hands. Both of them were covered in scars. Not small scars. Deep ones. Layered. The kind of damage that happens over decades. Not from one accident but from 100 of them. And he held those hands at his sides like they didn't bother him at all. She asked if she could see the children up close. Earl didn't answer right away. He looked back at the woman in the doorway. Something passed between them. Not a word. Just a look. Then he stepped aside. Linda walked up the porch steps and into the house. The smell hit her first. Not filth. Not exactly. Something closer to wood smoke and old bandages. The main room was dim. A wood stove in the corner. A long table. Benches instead of chairs. And sitting on one of those benches was the girl. The one who would press her hand to the stove 10 minutes later. But Linda didn't know that yet. What she saw first were the other children. A boy, maybe 10, with a crooked arm. It had clearly been broken and had healed without being set. He was using it. writing something on a piece of cardboard with a stub of pencil, the arm bent at an angle that should have made the task impossible. Another boy, older, maybe 13, had burns across both forearms. Not fresh, layered. Old burns on top of older burns. And a girl, maybe 15, the oldest of them, sat in the corner with a bandage wrapped around her left foot. The bandage was soaked through. Dark. She wasn't wincing. She wasn't shifting her weight. She was shelling beans into a bowl, calm as morning. Linda opened her clipboard. Her hands were shaking, but she wrote it down. All of it. The crooked arm. The burns. The soaked bandage. She asked Earl about medical care. He said they handled things themselves. She asked about the girl's foot. He said she'd stepped on a nail 3 days ago. Just a nail. Linda asked if it had been cleaned. He said yes. She asked if the girl had cried. Earl looked at her like the question didn't make sense. She don't cry, he said. None of them do. Now here's the thing. Linda had studied child welfare. She'd read about neglect, about abuse, about the ways poverty twists a family into something unrecognizable. But she had never read about this. She asked if she could examine the girl's foot. Earl hesitated. The woman in the doorway, who Linda now understood was Earl's wife, a woman named Nettie, stepped forward and said quietly, "Let her look." Linda knelt beside the girl. She unwrapped the bandage carefully. The wound was deep, infected, a puncture wound that had gone clean through the arch of the foot and out the other side. The nail was still embedded in the sole of the girl's shoe, which sat under the bench. The girl had stepped on it, walked on it for 3 days and never once complained. Linda looked up at the girl's face. No pain, no discomfort, nothing. Just a mild curiosity about why the stranger was kneeling at her feet. Linda rewrapped the wound as best she could and stood up. Her mind was racing. She asked Earl directly, "Your children, can they feel pain?" He didn't blink. "No," he said. "None of us can." That's when Linda understood she wasn't looking at neglect. She was looking at something she had no training for. Something medical. Something genetic. Something that had been breeding in these hills, in this family, for God knows how long. She asked Earl how many generations the family had lived here. He said his grandfather had built the main house. His father had built the cabins. Earl himself had never left the property for more than a day. He'd married Nettie, who was his second cousin. Their children had never seen a doctor, never been to a school, never been off the mountain except once, when the youngest had a fever and Nettie walked her down to the road and waited for a passing truck. Linda asked what happened. Nettie said a man drove them to a clinic in town. The doctor examined the child, asked questions, and then asked more questions. He wanted to run tests. He wanted to contact a university. Nettie took the girl and left. They never went back. Linda told Earl she needed to bring the children in for medical evaluation. That the wound on the girl's foot alone could lead to amputation if it wasn't treated properly. She said it calmly. She said it like someone who was used to delivering hard news. Earl listened. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just shook his head slowly and said, "You bring people here, they won't leave us alone. You know that." Linda promised she would keep it quiet. She said she would find a doctor who would be discreet. She said she was trying to help. Earl looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Last woman who said that didn't come back." Linda didn't know what that meant. Not then. She wrote down what she could, took 2 photographs of the children with a small camera she kept in her bag, and walked back to her car. The drive down the mountain felt longer than the drive up. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles ached. She drove 40 minutes to the first gas station with a payphone. She called Dale Pettis. She told him everything. The children, the injuries, the painlessness, the isolation. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Dale said something that stopped her cold. "Linda, I'm going to need you to close that file." She stood there, receiver pressed to her ear, and waited for the rest of the sentence. The explanation, the reason, it didn't come. She asked him what he meant. He said it again. "Close the file. Write it up as a routine visit. No concerns. And don't go back up there." Linda asked why. Dale's voice dropped. "Because I'm telling you to." She hung up. She sat in her car in the gas station lot for 15 minutes, staring at the road. She thought about the girl's foot, the infection creeping up toward her ankle, the nail still in the shoe. She thought about the boy's crooked arm, the way he swung it when he wrote, like it was just another part of his body that didn't work right and he'd stopped caring. She thought about Earl saying, "Last woman who said that didn't come back." And she thought about Dale Pettis, her own supervisor, a man she'd known for barely 2 months, telling her to close the file like he was asking her to forget a parking ticket. Something was wrong, not just with the Harlows, with the entire system that was supposed to protect them. That night, back in her apartment in town, Linda pulled the county archive key from her desk drawer. She'd been given it her first week on the job. Standard issue for all field workers. The next morning, before the office opened, she let herself into the basement records room. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just started pulling folders. Harlow, Harlow, she found 4 files. 4, spanning 20 years. Each one thinner than the last. The first, from 1958, was a full intake report. A social worker named Dottie Bream had visited the property and documented everything. Burns, broken bones, children who didn't react to injuries. She'd recommended immediate intervention and a medical evaluation for the entire family. The report was stamped, closed 2 weeks later. No follow-up, no explanation, no record of any action taken. The second file, from 1964, was almost identical. Different social worker, same findings, same recommendation, same result. Closed, no follow-up, no record. The third, from 1969, was just a single page. A note saying the assigned worker had requested reassignment and the case had been transferred. No transfer destination listed. The file ended there. And the fourth was from 1972. The assigned worker's name was Helen Pratt. Her report was 3 pages long and detailed. She'd noted the painlessness. She'd noted the intermarriage. She'd noted the children's injuries. She'd recommended state intervention. At the bottom of the 3rd page, someone had written in pencil, H. Pratt, terminated, November 1972. Linda stared at that line. Terminated. Not reassigned. Not transferred. Not retired. Terminated. She closed the folder, put everything back exactly where she found it, and walked out of the building into cold morning air. She sat on a bench across the street and made a decision. She was going back to the Harlows. Not because the county told her to, because every woman who had tried before her had been stopped, and somebody finally had to not stop. If you've been following this story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next is where everything changed. Linda drove back up Crooked Fork Road 3 days later. Same ruts, same gravel, same dirt, but this time she didn't park in the yard. She stopped the car 100 yards out, at the tree line, and walked in on foot. She wanted to see the property before anyone saw her. It was mid-morning. The children were outside. The boy with the crooked arm was chopping wood. Full swings, the axe head burying itself in the log each time, the impact traveling up through his misaligned bones, and the boy not even blinking. Linda watched from behind a stand of poplars and felt something cold settle inside her. Then she saw something new. A teenager she hadn't seen on her first visit. A boy maybe 16 or 17. Tall, broad across the shoulders. He came around the side of the barn carrying a steel bucket. He set it down near the fire pit, reached into the coals with his bare hand, and pulled out a stone that had been heating in the flames. He held it, turned it over in his fingers, examined it, then set it on a flat rock and went back for another one. His hand was red, already blistering. He didn't notice, or rather, he noticed the way you'd notice mud on your boot. Something to see, nothing to feel. Linda stepped out of the trees. The boy saw her immediately. He didn't startle. He just looked at her with flat, steady eyes and said, "Daddy told us you'd come back." Earl appeared on the porch. This time he didn't ask if he could help her. He just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. Linda walked up to him and said she wasn't there for the county. She was there for the children. She told him about the files. For visits over 20 years. For social workers. All of them shut down or removed. She asked him what happened to Helen Pratt. Earl's face changed. Not anger. Something closer to regret. He sat down on the porch step and rubbed his scarred hands together slowly. Then he talked. For the first time in Linda's presence, he actually talked. He told her that Helen Pratt was the only one who'd ever come back more than once. She'd visited 4 times over 2 months. She'd brought a doctor from the university on her 3rd visit. The doctor had examined the children, taken blood samples, and left excited, talking about papers he would write, studies he would conduct. Earl said he'd let it happen because Helen promised it would help. She said the tests might lead to treatment, maybe even a way to restore sensation. Earl said he'd believed her. 2 weeks later, a van showed up on the property with 3 men Earl had never seen. They had documents. They had official letterhead. They wanted to take 2 of the children to a research facility in Virginia for a period of observation. Earl refused. He said the men argued. They said it was in the children's best interest. Earl told them to leave. One of the men said something Earl never forgot. He said, "Mr. Harlow, these children don't belong only to you. They belong to science." Earl picked up a splitting maul that was leaning against the porch rail. He didn't swing it. He just held it. The men left. A week after that, Helen stopped coming. Earl called the county office. A woman on the phone told him Helen Pratt no longer worked there. He asked why. The woman said she couldn't discuss personnel matters. Earl never saw Helen again. He never found out what happened to her. But he knew. He knew because it was the same thing that had always happened. Someone got close. Someone got curious. And the system closed the door. "They didn't fire her because she failed," Earl said to Linda. "They fired her because she got too close." Linda asked who they were. Earl shrugged. "People who decide things. County people. University people. People who want to study my kids like they're animals in a cage." He looked up at her. "You seem decent. So I'll tell you what I told Helen before it went wrong. My family has been this way for as long as anyone can remember. My grandfather couldn't feel pain. My father couldn't feel pain. I can't feel pain. My children can't feel pain. We're not sick. We're not cursed. We're just different. And every time someone from the outside finds out, they don't want to help us. They want to use us." Linda sat down on the step next to him. She didn't argue. She didn't reach for her clipboard. She just sat there and let him talk. And Earl told her things no one had ever written down. He told her about his grandfather, a man named Silas Harlow, who had settled the property in 1903 after being run out of a mining town in the southern part of the state. The other miners thought he was possessed. He couldn't feel the cuts, the burns, the cave-ins that sent other men screaming. They thought he'd made a deal with something dark. Silas didn't argue. He just moved deeper into the hills. He married a woman from a family 3 hollows over. A family, Earl said, that had the same condition. Their children inherited it. Every single one. And those children married each other or married back into the other family, and the condition passed down generation after generation, undiluted. Earl said there had been 31 Harlows born on that property in 70 years. Every one of them painless. And every one of them had learned, the hard way, what pain was supposed to teach. He showed Linda his hands again. The scars layered so deep they looked like a map of everything he'd survived. "I learned not to touch hot things by watching my skin melt," he said. "Not by feeling it. You understand? I had to teach myself what hurt looks like, because I couldn't feel what it feels like." He said the children were the same. They had to be watched every minute when they were young. A toddler who can't feel pain will chew through its own tongue, will break its own fingers bending them backward, just to see how far they go, will walk on a broken leg until the bone comes through the skin. Earl said he'd lost a brother that way, a boy named Curtis, who'd fallen from the barn roof at age 9, shattered both legs, and crawled a quarter-mile back to the house without making a sound. By the time anyone found him, infection had set in deep. He died 4 days later, 9 years old. He was buried behind the barn. in a row of small graves that Linda hadn't noticed on her first visit. 7 graves in that row. 7 Harlows who had died not from disease, not from violence, but from the simple inability to know when their own bodies were breaking. Linda asked Earl about the girl with the nail wound. He said her name was Posey. She was his youngest. He said the wound was bad and he knew it. He'd been cleaning it with creek water and a poultice his wife made from comfrey root. He knew it wasn't enough. He knew the girl could lose her foot. But he also knew what happened when Harlows went to hospitals. The questions. The stares. The doctors who stopped treating and started studying. He'd rather lose his daughter's foot than lose his daughter to a system that would pull her apart trying to understand her. Linda looked at him and said, "Earl, that wound is going to kill her. Not her foot. The infection is already spreading. I can see it in the color of that bandage. If she doesn't get antibiotics in the next 48 hours, you're going to bury another child behind that barn." Earl went quiet. His jaw worked. His scarred hands gripped his knees. Nettie appeared in the doorway again. She'd been listening the whole time. She looked at Earl and said one word. "Please." That word broke something open. Earl stood up without answering her. He went inside and came back carrying Posey in his arms. The girl was small, pale, lighter than she should have been. She looked up at Linda with those same curious, painless eyes and said, "Am I going somewhere?" Linda nodded. "You're going to see a doctor, sweetheart." Posey smiled. "Will it hurt?" Linda almost couldn't answer that. She had to swallow before she spoke. "No, honey, you won't feel a thing." And she meant it in a way that cracked her wide open. Because that was the whole truth of the Harlows. They wouldn't feel a thing. They never had. And that was the most dangerous thing about them. Not to the world. To themselves. Linda drove Posey down the mountain to the county hospital in Boone. The girl sat in the passenger seat the whole way, barefoot, looking out the window at trees she had never passed before. She didn't ask questions. She didn't complain about the bumps in the road. She just watched the world go by with the quiet fascination of someone seeing it for the first time. At the hospital, Linda told the admitting nurse the girl had stepped on a nail. She didn't mention the family name, didn't mention the condition. She gave her own address as the emergency contact and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours while they cleaned the wound, administered 4 antibiotics, and set the girl up in a bed. A doctor came out and told Linda that another 12 hours and the infection would have reached the bone. Posey would have lost the foot, maybe her life. He asked why the girl hadn't come in sooner. Linda said the family was remote and didn't have transportation. The doctor looked at her, looked at Posey's chart and said, "This child has no pain response. We ran a standard reflex test. Nothing. No withdrawal. No flinch. Nothing at all." He asked if Linda knew about the condition. She said yes. He asked if there were others in the family. Linda paused. She thought about Earl. About the files in the basement. About Helen Pratt, who got too close and disappeared from the county roster. And she said, "No, just her. As far as I know." The doctor didn't believe her. She could see it in his face. But he didn't push. He treated the girl, kept her for 3 days on antibiotics, and discharged her with instructions for wound care that Linda wrote down word for word. Linda drove Posey back up the mountain on a cold, bright morning. She carried the girl up the porch steps and set her down where Earl was waiting. He took his daughter, held her against his chest, pressed his scarred hand against the back of her head. He looked at Linda and said 2 words. "Thank you." Then, after a pause, "Don't come back." Linda nodded. She understood. She got in her car. She drove down the mountain. And she never went back. But she didn't close the file. Not the way Dale Pettis wanted her to. She wrote the real report. Every detail. The condition. The isolation. The generations of intermarriage. The previous social workers. The termination of Helen Pratt. The 7 graves behind the barn. She wrote 22 pages by hand, sitting at her kitchen table, and when she was done she made 3 copies. She sealed each one in a separate envelope. One she mailed to the state welfare office in Charleston. One she mailed to the medical school library at West Virginia University. And one she kept. She put it in a shoebox under her bed and left it there. The state office never responded. Not a letter. Not a phone call. Nothing. The library filed it in a miscellaneous donations box without reading it. And Linda kept working her cases. She kept driving backcountry roads. She kept checking on families the system had forgotten. She never spoke about the Harlows publicly. She never told another coworker what she'd seen. But she kept that third copy. Every time she moved, the shoebox came with her. Years passed. Linda married a high school teacher named George. Had 2 children of her own. Left social work in 1983 and took a job at a school district office. She never went back to field work. She said it was because she wanted something steadier, something with regular hours and no gravel roads. But George knew the real reason. She'd seen something she couldn't fix, and staying in the work meant being reminded of it every day. Dale Pettis retired in 1985. Nobody replaced him for 6 months. The county welfare office moved to a new building in 1988, and half the old basement archives were destroyed in the process. Boxes of files, decades of records, dumped into a landfill because nobody thought they mattered. The Harlows stayed on their mountain. Nobody went up. Nobody came down. Then, in 1991, a genetics researcher named Dr. Alan Whitfield published a paper in a medical journal. The paper described a rare condition called congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis, CIPA, a mutation in a single gene that controls nerve development, rendering certain people completely unable to feel physical pain. The condition also affects the ability to sweat, which means overheating is a constant danger. The paper cited case studies from around the world, isolated populations, families in rural Pakistan, a clan in northern Sweden, and one unnamed family in Appalachian, West Virginia, described only as a multi-generational kinship group exhibiting uniform CIPA phenotype across at least 4 verified generations. The source for that entry was listed as anonymous field notes, submitted to WVU Medical Library, circa 1976. Linda's envelope. Someone had eventually opened it. Someone had read her 22 pages. And someone had passed the information along to a researcher who understood what it meant. Linda found the paper by accident. She was sitting in a dentist's waiting room in 1993, flipping through a stack of old magazines, when she came across a short article summarizing Whitfield's findings. She read it twice. Then she set the magazine down, walked to her car, and sat there for 20 minutes with the engine off. She wasn't angry. She wasn't proud. She was just thinking about Posey, wondering if the girl still had both feet, wondering if she'd grown up, wondering if she'd married someone inside the family, the way the Harlows always had, wondering if she'd ever learned what pain was supposed to feel like, or if she'd gone her whole life steering through a world full of warnings she couldn't receive. Linda Calloway died in 2014 at the age of 64. Quietly, in her own bed, her daughter, a woman named Sarah, found the shoebox while cleaning out the house 2 weeks later. Inside was the sealed envelope, still unopened, still taped shut with the same brown packing tape Linda had used 38 years earlier. Sarah opened it. She read her mother's report, all 22 pages, and she sat on the floor of that empty bedroom and cried. Not because the story was sad, because her mother had never told her, had carried it alone for nearly 4 decades and never said a word. Sarah contacted a journalist named Michael Ames, who wrote for a regional Appalachian magazine. He published a long feature the following spring. The story mentioned no family names, no locations, no identifying details, just the shape of what had happened. A family that couldn't feel pain, a system that couldn't feel shame, and one young woman who drove up a mountain because she decided that closing a file wasn't the same as closing her eyes. The Harlow property still stands. Or at least, satellite images show structures in the approximate area described in Linda's report. The current condition of the cabins is unknown. No one has confirmed whether the family is still there or how many of them remain. County records from before 1980 were largely destroyed. No living social worker from the Boone County office has confirmed or denied the existence of the family. But in the medical literature, The unnamed Appalachian kinship group with uniform CIPA expression remains one of the most cited case studies in the field of pain genetics. Researchers reference it in papers about nerve development, about inherited sensory disorders, about the biology of suffering itself. Not because of what was discovered, but because of how long it was hidden, and because of who finally brought it to light. There's a line in Linda's original report, near the end, that the journalist quoted in his piece. She wrote it in 1976, sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the night she brought Posey home. She wrote, "Pain is not a punishment. It is a warning. And without it, every day is a walk through a world you cannot fully understand." Nobody read those words for 38 years, but they were true the day she wrote them, and they're true now.